Hello there. This is All 24 News special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file with me, Karim Fazakari. Next up, we're going to be talking about the Russian forces which are continuing to deploy outdated military equipment to Ukraine to replace losses of the Ukrainian main intelligence directorate reported that on the 9th of June that Russian forces are mining Kherson Oblast with mines from the 1950s to defend against recent Ukrainian counterattacks in northwestern Kherson Oblast. The fight for Severodonetsk is a Russian information operation in the form of a battle. One of its main purposes for Moscow is to create the impression that Russia has regained the strength and will now overwhelm Ukraine. We will raise some of these concerns and other questions with our panel of guests. I am joined live via Skype by David Powell, a commentator on Arab and international affairs from UK, along with Mirko Giordani, CEO and founder of Perilla Strategic Advisory Group from Italy. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. We go on a short break and we get down to discussion. So here's what's on tap today. 2 British men and a Moroccan captured while fighting in the Ukrainian army in Mariupol have been sentenced to death by pro-Russia officials. The 3 were convicted of being foreign mercenaries. The court said they now have 1 month to appeal and will possibly receive a reduced sentence. The ruling was quickly condemned by British officials. The Russian Foreign Minister, meanwhile, Sergei Lavrov, said Britons and Moroccans sentenced to death committed crimes in the Donetsk.
This is the most egregious breach of international law, and these individuals need to be released immediately and returned to their families. You cannot treat British citizens in this manner and get away with it. This is a Soviet-era show trial, and these British citizens are now being apparently sentenced to death.
At the moment, the process you mentioned are based on the legislation of the Donetsk People's Republic, because the crimes you are talking about were committed on the territory of the DPR. Everything else is the subject of speculation.
Mr. David Powell, let me commence with you regarding the latest imprisonment and sentencing to death regarding these mercenaries, as Russia called them. How do you comment?
Well, Russia calls these 2 fighters mercenaries, but in fact they were living in Ukraine before the invasion, before the Russian invasion. This was not a case of men going to fight after the invasion happened and joining some militia group. They were part of the Ukrainian armed forces, the official armed forces of Ukraine. And as such, the British government argues that they should be treated as prisoners of war, and therefore not put on trial, and certainly not in a court that has no international legitimacy. This is a court in Donetsk, recognized by Russia alone, and by all accounts, there was little due process during the trial. There was no evidence produced for what crimes these men were supposed to have committed, as the Russian foreign minister claims. So the British government's attitude is that these are prisoners of war, they should be released. Now, it looks in all probability that this court, supposedly an independent court in Donetsk, was in fact under the control of Russia. I mean, Russia's reaction has been swift, and most commentators think that these 2 men, who now have a month to appeal against their sentence, are in fact going to be used as bargaining chips by Russia to gain possibly the release of the Putin ally who is imprisoned in Ukraine and was thought to be the man who would take over running Ukraine if the Russian invasion had gone to plan and they'd have overthrown the government in the first few days and weeks. So there's a lot of suspicion that these two men are going to be used, as I say, as bargaining chips to gain something for Moscow.
Mr. David Powell, don't you think that this perhaps came in retaliation against previous trials against Russian soldiers in Ukraine?
Well have done. I mean, it's impossible to know what the calculations are in Moscow and why they would have done this. Possibly revenge, but possibly it was. I mean, these men have been well known. It's no secret that they've been fighting with the Ukrainian armed forces. So this could have been planned some time ago. As I say, it's impossible to speculate. But the important thing is why they have been. Now sentenced, why they've been given a month to appeal, what that appeal could be. But in all likelihood, they are going to be used as some kind of bargaining chips for Moscow.
Well, what about you, Mr. Marco Giordani? How do you see the latest development on the ground regarding the Russia-Ukraine war? And can we find a neutral part here in leading the trials? Because we see Ukraine capturing soldiers and sending them to court, and the same thing goes with Russia. Is there a neutral way to do that?
Listen, like we are in a war. This is a war where there is a lot of propaganda. Obviously, there is the Russian propaganda, which we all know. And there is obviously, the Ukrainian propaganda. This seems fair, like when you have to support the war struggles, you need a communication machine, you need a propaganda machine. Is this a fair trial? Obviously, no. As your other distinguished guest said, Donetsk, the Republic in Donetsk, it's practically Russia. It's de facto Russia. So this is not a Donetsk court like Lavrov has said. This is a Russian court. And again, I agree with what your other guests said, that the free prisoners will be used most probably as bargaining chips for other Russians that are being captive in Kiev, in Ukraine. That's for sure. How do I see the development of the war? Let me be frank with you, as I have always been. Were the weapons supposed to let the Ukrainians win the war? Yes. Were the sanctions supposed to demoralize and to make Russia capitulate? Yes. So we need to understand whether or not these two things are working out on the field. What about the sanctions? Sanctions obviously will be useful to cripple the Russian economy, yes, but we will see it in the next months. Sanctions are not like
something that can take effect that quickly. And before we delve into effects, let me just share with you this info and this report regarding the repercussions or the global impact of the war. Russia and Ukraine produce a third of the world's wheat supply, and the loss of commodities due to the war has resulted in soaring food prices and uncertainty about the future of food security globally, especially in impoverished countries. Let's follow this report and we get back to you, Mr. Mirko Giordani.
The World Food Programme is warning of catastrophic failure in food supply chains, which could lead to starvation and global instability. Known as the breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine has over 25 million tons of grain that cannot be exported due to Russia's claimed blockade of its Black Sea ports, while Russia is accusing Ukraine of not taking a decisive decision in concerns of the matter.
Still 25 million tons of grain and oilseeds left in Ukraine. That's a third of last year's harvest. So we already have a huge logistical problem.
Ukraine and Russia together export a third of the world's wheat and barely half of its sunflower oil, while Russia is the top supplier of fertilizer that has surged in price.
I'm really anxious. I mean, the only option is to get the grain out of Ukraine is through the Black Sea ports. They have to be opened. That's the only option.
The European Commission made proposals Thursday aimed at helping Ukraine export its agricultural goods and circumvent a claimed Russian blockade of the country's ports that is preventing critical supplies of grains from reaching the global market.
Apart from economic and food security reasons, pressure is mounting to free storage capacity for the coming harvest. So, 20 million tons of grains must leave Ukraine in less than 3 months.
The European Union's executive arm said the plan, largely based on the establishment of alternative logistic routes and an increase of freight services using all transport modes, should also facilitate imports of goods, including humanitarian aid, into the war-torn country.
So, if we do the math, we will see that an astonishing 10,000 barges and almost 300 large ships are needed to carry 20 million tons of grains.
As an impact of the war in Ukraine, shortages of fuel and fertilizer in many countries and accelerating spikes in food prices threaten to destabilize fragile societies, increase hunger and malnutrition, drive migration, and cause severe economic dislocation. Conflict has greatly exacerbated food security issues globally.
So I get back to you, Mr. Mirko Giordani. Since you mentioned sanctions on Russia, we see that the sanctions, of course, had repercussions, or let's say global repercussions, and mainly on food crisis, which was already existent. It doesn't mean that the food crisis was a direct result of the Russia-Ukraine war, but then we see the West portraying it as though it is the main reason for skyrocketing food prices. What do you have to say about that, Mr. Mirko Giordani?
Okay, I want to continue with what I was saying before about the impact of the sanctions on the war in Ukraine. So, first of all, we need to understand that the sanctions will cripple Russian economy, yes, but it didn't end the war. Russians on the field are, reports are very confusing, but pretty much we know that Russia owns 1/5 of Ukrainian territory, which is far away from a victory for Ukraine. And I am saying by repeating that I am supporting Ukraine and I am supporting Ukrainian struggles. Getting back to your question about farming products, the first repercussions will be, we need to be very precise on that. The first repercussions will be on countries on the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, so Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt. Egypt import 100% of grains from Ukraine and Russia. Gosh, it's unbelievable how much in this summer these countries will suffer. If we, in 2008, when there were the Arab Springs had some clear signals, which was the rising cost of bread. The political turmoils on the MENA region started because of the rising cost of bread and grains. So we need to be very, very careful, especially the countries in south of Europe. We need to be very careful in solving this issue, because if we have rising prices of bread and all the other derivatives of grains, we will have political instabilities in countries such as Egypt, in countries such as Libya, in countries such as Syria, and other parts of the MENA region. And after, it will not be only problems in the east of Europe, in Ukraine. We will have problems in North Africa. We will have problems in the Middle East, and we will have a new migration crisis, which only a few countries in south of Europe will have to resolve, will have to handle. Because we understand that any solutions, any unifying solution in Europe to solve this issue, it's not working. It didn't work. Let's remember the Malta agreements. They met like ice under the sun.
But so Mr. Mirko Giordani, I mean, the repercussions, you've been putting a lot of emphasis on impoverished countries, but then we see the repercussions even in Europe. A lot of commodities have raised. I mean, their prices skyrocketed due to the rising energy prices. What do you have to say about the perhaps, let's say, predicted social unrest in European countries?
This is a very smart question. In Europe, there will be political crisis, I believe so. Social instability, maybe a bit, but we will not have the scenes that we have seen in the Middle East or North Africa. I want to emphasize that in Europe there are political institutions that can try to have a democratic outcome of these turmoils. Okay. In the Middle East and North Africa, I don't see this democratic channel where all these grievances can be grouped, okay, and can be streamed. peacefully. So my fear is that in Europe we will have rising prices, we will have families that will suffer more, yes, but we will not have any democratic, any serious political turmoil with violence. In the Middle East and North Africa, I believe so. We can have it because the region has experienced that kind of violence, that kind of uprising just 14 years ago. Okay, you have experienced that kind of turmoils. We will experience some kind of economic regression, but you will experience real.
But don't you think
violent
perhaps the
political
scene of the yellow vest, for example, back to France? I mean, the main reason why there was that social unrest in France itself was because of rising prices and people not being able to afford things. And there are a lot of, let's say, the budget, the aid that was deployed to Ukraine was enormous, and apparently it's not going to stop there. And perhaps these countries, European countries, US at top, are in dire need of this kind of fund to, let's say, direct their own problems, domestically, that is.
In the French case, you're right. I was saying that maybe the only country that has more, that can experience more political turmoil is France. But again, you will not see any levels of violence that you have seen in the Middle East or North Africa. I want to go back to your questions about rising cost of energy. I believe it's a big problem. It's a big problem because investments will be slowed down. We have noticed a slowdown in M&A, mergers and acquisition around Europe and also in America. We are noticing a slowdown of investments. For example, the 700 billions that Europe put after COVID, they are getting seriously eaten by the rising cost of goods. It's eaten by the inflation.
Yes. Mr. David Powell, thank you, Mr. Mirko Giordani. I would like to raise this question with Mr. David Powell regarding the sanction policy by the West and at the top, the United States of America, seeing that domestically these countries are actually facing a lot of domestic problems and people are complaining about the enormous aid sent to Ukraine, although the West try to portray that everybody is in support of Ukraine, but then let's face it, especially American people, they care about their own interests, domestic interests, and we see here that technically they are not able to afford a lot of domestic projects that are essential for them to face, for example, the unemployment problem they have.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, obviously, all countries look to their own interests first, and consumers in the US are no different from elsewhere. And if they see prices rising, they get worried. But I think, as Mr. Giordani made clear, there are two different things here. Grain is an immediate problem, and as the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has warned, grain shortages could lead to famine. Serious food shortages and even famine in the poorer parts of the world. And those poorer parts of the world tend to be the more politically unstable ones. So this is a direct threat to the stability of countries in North Africa and indeed sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. Now,
and you don't see the rising prices perhaps would affect European countries as well?
Yes, but these are not. It's not the rising grain prices that are the main problem here. It's rising fuel prices. Well, the cost of living as a whole. But I mean, it's not a threat to the democratic stability of those countries. What it does do, though, is undermine Western solidarity over sanctions, as you mentioned. And this has become a serious problem. In the early days of the Ukraine war, there was quite a surprising consensus in the West about sanctioning Russia, and punitive sanctions were put on individuals, on companies, on banks, and on energy. Now it comes to energy prices rising as they are, and this is causing problems especially within the EU. And last month, the agreement to try and cut to sanction Russian oil and cut all imports of Russian oil really didn't succeed. There was an agreement to stop imports of Russian oil by sea, but not by pipeline, because several countries, notably Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and Germany, are dependent on Russian oil. Germany and Poland have said they'd phase out Russian oil by the end of the year, but Hungary and Slovenia not. So not only is Russian oil continuing to flow into Europe with the high energy prices, this is giving Russia quite a good income. So, and this is undermining the whole sanctions pressure that the high.
So the sanctions was a bad card to play here.
I wouldn't say it was a bad card. What card did we have to play? I mean, there's no ideal solution to this, but other than full-scale war, sanctions are the best weapon that Western countries have to try and cripple the Russian economy so they can't afford. I'm just saying.
But how do you explain the ruble going high? How do you explain the ruble going so high? It did quite the opposite, don't you see?
I wouldn't say it did the opposite. I'm saying that these sanctions are of limited effect. Sanctions are always of limited effect. They're never a perfect tool. I'm just pointing out the difficulties now with global oil prices. But the hope is that there will be more agreement, at least to stop Russian imports in the long term. President Putin has said this is unlikely, but then he would say that. European leaders are hoping that gradually there will be a phasing out of Russian oil, but it's admittedly not a strong weapon. It's not having perhaps the desired effect on the Russian economy. As you mentioned, the ruble going high, and as I say, imports from the sale of hydrocarbons is quite considerable to Russia now because the price is so high. It's a difficult situation.
Yes, but Mr. David Powell here, let me raise this question regarding the food crisis. I mean, a lot of analysts are accusing Russia of using it as a weapon, and on the other hand, we have other analysts saying that Ukraine is using it as a weapon. In either case scenario, who is to blame here?
I don't quite see how Ukraine could be using its own grain supplies
because they said they were the ones who mined the port, and perhaps they are using it to put pressure on the West to perhaps urge them to send them the weapons they need to fight back Russia.
Well, we have seen the African Union, whose members are going to suffer most, or are indeed already suffering most from this grain shortage. They have asked Ukraine to demine the port of Odessa. Yes, that's true. Ukraine's argument is that, well, we'd like to do that. We want to export the grain, but if we demine the port, that leaves Russia the ability to invade by sea. So I don't think Ukraine is deliberately blocking its own food supplies. It's trying to block a naval invasion by Russia. It's Russia who occupies most of the southern coast of Ukraine and is stopping the export. It's not Ukraine. So if you ask me who's principally to blame, then of course it's Russia. And there are also reports of Russia stealing Ukrainian grain to sell itself to countries in need. Which, I mean, why not? If you're as ruthless a ruler as Putin is, then you would use grain. You'd use any weapon at your disposal. That's he's proved that he has no moral scruples at all. It's quite conceivable that Russia is doing this.
Understood, Mr. David Powell. Now, let me share with you, Mr. Mirko Giordani. 3 days after surviving a vote of no confidence led by his British party or his own party, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson warned against any desire on the part of the West to encourage Ukraine to accept a bad compromise with Russia. His speech comes following the UK's announcement to supply Ukraine with long-range rocket artillery, despite threats from Russian President Vladimir Putin of hitting new targets if the West continues to take similar steps.
To encourage a bad peace in Ukraine is to encourage Putin and to encourage all those around the world who believe that aggression pays. And that would be a mistake that would open the door to further conflict, further instability, further global uncertainty, and therefore further economic misery.
So, Mr. Mirko Giordani, what is, according to you, a bad compromise with Russia regarding this file?
Okay, first of all, let me say that you can agree or disagree with what Boris Johnson and what the UK foreign policy is dictating, but It seems that the UK can manage to pull out that kind of foreign policy because it's independent from Europe. Within the European Union, we have different positions. You have Germany and Italy, which are Germany most of all, which is pushing against sending more weapons. We have a lot of parties in Italy here that are pushing to send less weapons to Ukraine. We have France, which have a different position, a more brokering position. And we have the Visegrad bloc, which is fully against Russia. But within Visegrad group, you have Hungary, which is still receiving oil via pipeline from Russia. So it's more confusing. You have London, which is following a precise straight line, which has always followed since the start of the war. Close this parenthesis. I want to say that what is a bad compromise? A bad compromise doesn't exist, I have to say. I believe that this war will finish when there will be a clear winner. It's sad to say, but I don't see Putin going away from Ukraine like this, without doing nothing. I don't see Ukraine overwhelmingly winning against Russians. So the war will be finished when Russia will have accomplished all the strategic and military goals. Mm-hmm. This is, I believe, the reality on the field. Mm-hmm. Russia is following its usual doctrine. I don't see any mistakes in the doctrine that Russia is following, using all the men that can have to invade a country. Russia has demonstrated that it can sacrifice all the men to defend or to attack. We have seen it during the Second World War. We have seen it during the First World War. It's a strategic doctrine which Russia is still using. They don't mind about sending men to slaughter and to sacrifice in Ukraine. They are continuing to sending like waves of people over there, like fresh troops which are fighting. And they are dying and no one cares. Sincerely, no one cares if these Russians are dying over there. Mm-hmm. Not even Russians elite. So they are sending people, and Russia will continue to do it until the costs of doing it will be lower than the cost of not sending them. Okay, until all the strategic and military goals of Russia will be accomplished, Russia will continue to send people over there.
Understood, Mr.
So that will be the compromise. Mm-hmm. If we are trying to find any other possible compromise that can make both happy, we are not observing what's happening in the reality. We are not observing what is the strategic goal of Russia. We're not observing what is the military goals of Russia.
Mm-hmm. So in here, you mean like there is going to be a worst case scenario for either part. And here, let me address Mr. David Powell here. We see that French President Emmanuel Macron criticized the West's way of handling the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And he said that the West did fail diplomatically in convincing Russia, perhaps from the very beginning when it waged its war against Ukraine. And here, Mr. David Powell, how do you see this? Do you agree with Emmanuel Macron saying that the West badly managed this crisis? And here we have UK, British Prime Minister, saying that there could be a bad compromise, and he insists on sending more weapons despite the threat of Russia of perhaps creating new targets.
I think the position of Emmanuel Macron is, and indeed the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, in seeking not to humiliate Putin. This was the words that he used, not to humiliate Putin. Really angered the Ukrainians. President Zelensky came out very strongly and criticized this as giving in to Russia. And countries like the US and the UK are pledged to do the very opposite, to try and humiliate Putin and humiliate Russia, if you like. I think the UK actually said that this needed to end in failure for Putin, because if it doesn't, then it would just encourage him to do more. And the strategic aims that Mr. Giordani talked about, exactly right. But who knows what Russia's strategic aims are? This is the question that the Western leaders are trying to answer. What does Russia really want? I mean, does it just want the eastern Donbas region? Does it want the south of Ukraine? Or does it want more? I mean, yesterday, President Putin spoke at a meeting commemorating the 350th anniversary of the birth of Peter the Great, in which he talked about reclaiming Russian territory. That he was on the same, following the same policy as this former Russian emperor, trying to reclaim areas of Europe, including Sweden. And this really raises questions about really what the Russian aim is.
And with so doing, and the
Ukraine?
West insisting on supporting Ukraine and sending more weapons, don't you think there could be a miscalculation somehow from either side, and the war could spill into NATO countries here?
Well, this is obviously the big fear, and this is why NATO is not taking an active part in terms of troops, and is simply sending weapons to Ukraine. There's no move within any NATO countries to actually get involved on the ground. That, of course, that's always a risk in any conflict, is to control it. But the policy now is to provide enough weapons for Ukraine to push back. Either to push back Russia to the border, but if not, to give it a strong negotiating position. This is what the Americans are talking about, a strong negotiating position in any final negotiations over that will eventually bring this conflict to an end.
Very nice. And Mr. Mirko Giordani, as a final question to wrap it up, do you think that Recep Tayyip Erdogan can play a major role to ease the situation here between Ukraine and Russia?
Sorry, could you repeat?
I said, taking into consideration the tense situation that Ukraine and Russia file is witnessing, do you think that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan can play an important role here in easing this tension?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Turkey is part of NATO, so that gives Turkey an uppercut during the negotiations. However, I don't know what will be the position of the West in having Turkey as a lead negotiator. I remember like 6 months, 7 months ago, like Turkey was in the middle. Do you remember that episode where Erdogan didn't greet Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, and Turkey seems like a pariah country. However, like, Turkey is a very, very important country. Turkey is the country which is managing the flux of immigrants and flux of refugees from the Middle East, which again, it can happen because we have to think forward. I am a political analyst and I'm trying to think forward. What will be the role of Turkey in case the grain situation will not be solved?
Mr. Mirko Giordani, sorry to interrupt you. We have reached the end of our talk show. Thank you so much for your thorough analysis. Perhaps another episode, then we can delve deeper. Thank you so much, David Powell, Mirko Giordani. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. That's the end. Bye for now.